Hello, and welcome to the Dallas Fed 2022 Texas Economic Outlook. I am Roberto Coronado, Senior Vice President at the Dallas Fed, and I'll be your moderator today. The Texas Economic Outlook, it's our premier economic forecasting event at the Dallas Fed, where we share economic perspectives, regional trends, and the forecast for the coming year for the Texas economy. A silver lining of the pandemic is that we're able to bring this event to you once again virtually. Once limited by geography and space constraints, today we're happy to be able to meet demand of this event and share this important outlook directly with a lot of people from across the state and quite frankly from across the nation. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize the profound effect COVID-19 is having on people across the US and the world. We at the Dallas Fed are first and foremost concerned about those who are being impacted by the virus, including the many health challenges and economic stress it is causing. All of us at the Fed continue to prioritize the safety and well-being of both the communities that we serve and our workforce. During these challenging times, I'm united with my Fed colleagues from across the country in our commitment to the American people and the job Congress gave us, which is to promote maximum employment and stable prices while protecting the stability of the financial system. At the Fed, we're doing all we can to help families and businesses weather this difficult time, and we will continue to use our tools at our disposal to assure that the recovery is as robust as possible and that we continue building a stronger economy together. I have a couple of housekeeping items that I want to share with you before we start. In addition to the pre-submitted questions that many of you sent us, which by the way, we're very grateful for those, we will be taking audience questions today during the program. We want to hear from you. We will try to take as many as we can during the time allotted for this event. You have two ways to submit questions during today's event. First, you can submit a question at any point during the program, a written question that is, using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You will also be able to ask a live question, and all you have to do is raise your virtual hand. That will put you in the queue, and we will call you upon once we are in the Q&A portion of the program. Now, many of you may have noticed that Kit Phillips is not presenting today. After 38 years of dedicated service to the Dallas Fed, Kit Phillips has decided to move on to a well-deserved retirement. We will certainly miss him around here, but his positive impacts on all of us at the Dallas Fed will remain for years to come. Keith is not only very well known and respected throughout the Federal Reserve System, but he is a widely respected expert on the Texas economy and has been consistently named the most accurate forecaster for Texas job growth in the Western Blue Chip Economic Forecast. We appreciate very much Keith's significant contributions to the bank, to the Federal Reserve System, and we want to thank him for his years of service, dedicated service to our central bank, and want to wish him the very best of luck in his retirement. Now, allow me to introduce a speaker today, Pia Orenius. Pia is a labor economist working on regional economic growth and demographic change. She leads our regional and microeconomics group at the Dallas Fed Research Department, and it's the executive editor of a flagship publication, Southwest Economy. Her academic research focuses on issues with respect to labor market impacts of immigration. In addition to her work at the Dallas Fed, she is affiliated with several academic institutions. She is a research fellow at the Tower Center for Public Policy and International Affairs, also a fellow at the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center at SMU, a fellow at the ISA Institute of Labor and Bonn, Germany, and as well as an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Previously, Pia served as a senior economist on the Council of Economic Advisors, where she advised the Bush administration on labor, health, and immigration issues. She holds a PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles and bachelor's degrees both in economics and Spanish from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Pia, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Roberto. Hello and good morning to all. Thank you, Roberto, for the kind introduction. And I'm really happy to be here today to share the Dallas Fed's 2022 Texas employment forecast. But not so fast. Before we start, we have a few things that we have to take care of. Let's see. First of all is a disclaimer. So yes, the Fed pays me, but I don't speak for the Federal Reserve System. So the opinions expressed in this presentation are my own. So let's start with an overview. I thought it'd be interesting to sort of revisit the pandemic experience from the Texas point of view. And really, the pandemic has been a very unusual economic downturn for a number of reasons. I cite some of them here. Instead of falling, incomes rose in the pandemic. Instead of declining demand for goods and housing, the demand for these assets actually surged. Typically in a recession, there's a very stable demand for services. So the service sector typically does well in a downturn, but not in the pandemic. Obviously, the service sector has suffered greatly in the pandemic. And then lastly, labor shortages. Typically, economic downturns are characterized by excess supply of labor, and we are kind of living through the opposite experience. Interestingly, despite the significant impact of COVID on public health in our state and also on the labor supply, Texas growth has still outperformed the nation in the pandemic overall over these 2 years and also in 2021. In fact, what I'll show you is that growth in our region actually accelerated in the second half of 2021, and that's giving some momentum to our forecast. So we'll get there a little bit later in the presentation. So the Dallas Fed Economic Outlook suggests that Texas will outperform the nation again in 2022. But I do want to mention some of the risks to the outlook. So obviously COVID continues to be a risk to the outlook, just in terms of new variants and other iterations of how it's affecting us domestically, and also, frankly, how it's affecting the global economy and supply chains. Supply side constraints abound, and to the extent that they are not resolved quickly this year, they're going to continue to weigh on the outlook. Supply side constraints include supply chain disruptions, but also the labor market. The labor market is also, as I mentioned, experiencing shortages. And then there's continued high inflation. So that's really the third most significant risk to the outlook. And we expect, obviously, and hope that inflation will resolve itself. But to the extent that high inflation continues and feeds into what economists call inflation expectations, that is a concern of the Fed, and that's certainly a risk to the outlook. All right, so let's get started here. Let me first demonstrate, just with a few charts, sort of how unusual this recession and recovery in the pandemic has been. So here we see Texas recessions going back in time, all the way back to the 1980s. And you can see, obviously, the pandemic recession is completely different. That's the yellow line, is sort of a very sharp, short-lived decline and a very steep recovery. So in terms, and what these are showing really is the progression of employment during each recession. And so you can see that employment fell very steeply. In Texas, we lost 1.4 million jobs just in the first 2 months of the pandemic, and then we've sort of been building back, and we're finally back, as you can tell, that the yellow line has recovered quite quickly. But it's a very unusual pattern for a recession. One reason it's so unusual is because personal income in this recession, this downturn, actually rose and didn't fall. So here I'm showing you in blue is personal income, how it changed during each of these recessions. So the pandemic recession, and then back in 2008, 2001, and so forth. And you can see that generally the blue bars are in the negative territory, because usually in a recession, personal income falls. But in this pandemic downturn, personal income rose, and it rose significantly. And it rose even though, as you can see from the orange line, that wages and salaries really fell. So how did that happen? Well, this is the federal stimulus programs, whether it's the stimulus checks, the federal supplemental unemployment benefits, the PPP program, all the stimulus that was put into the economy actually did an amazing job, maybe too good of a job, propping up income, which then has led to some of the unusual other facets of this recession as we've been experiencing. And here is one. This is house prices. So normally in a recession, and here I'm showing you the Great Recession in the middle of the chart. You can see that big recession shading in the middle of the chart. You can see from the red line what happened to US house prices in the Great Recession, where they completely tanked. There wasn't much change in Texas because our house prices had not really risen prior to the Great Recession. But then look towards the right end of the chart and you'll see that this pandemic has been characterized by very steeply rising house prices. Also, stock market has been rising, so asset prices in general have gone up. And this is a very unusual experience, especially for Texas, where the housing supply tends to be pretty elastic. Economists like to call it, in the sense that we do build a lot here in Texas to accommodate demand. Nevertheless, house prices have soared in the pandemic downturn. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how Texas fared in the pandemic compared to other states. So here again is job growth, and you can see it's mostly negative in terms of where we are in terms of employment for most states today, as opposed to before the pandemic in February 2020. So most states are still not back to pre-pandemic levels of employment. Texas is one of only 4 states that have exceeded their pre-pandemic level of employment. The other states are pretty small. It's I think Idaho and maybe Montana and Arizona. And Texas is a very, very large state compared to them, and we're back. So that's a remarkable achievement. So we've regained all the jobs that we lost in the pandemic. Which states have done the worst? Well, typically states that rely a lot on tourism, like Hawaii, Nevada, for example, are towards the bottom of the pack here, and they've suffered greatly economically in the pandemic. But here I'm going to show you some employment in the pandemic downturn across sectors. And here the point is, although we are back in terms of aggregate employment, we are back in terms of recovering all the jobs we lost in the pandemic. Not every sector is back. In fact, most sectors are not back. You can see from the blue lines that are in the positive territory on this chart that the main sectors that are back are trade, transportation, and utilities, professional and business services, and financial activities. In the US economy, which is the red bar, you can see that really only one sector is back above pre-pandemic level of employment. So what you're seeing on this chart, what it's capturing is a massive reallocation of jobs away from certain sectors, the ones that are still in negative territory, towards the growth sectors. And so whether it's people leaving, say, retail for parcel delivery services, or whether it's the boom in residential real estate, whether it's the boom in the tech industry, with all the demand for new technology products and technology services in the pandemic. So these are all very hot, fast-growing sectors. And then we've seen especially the sectors that have come back a little bit later in the pandemic downturn, they're now trying to hire and are not able to hire. The energy sector is a great example. The energy sector lost 20–25% of their workers in the first year of the pandemic when oil prices plummeted. But of course, now they need to hire them back. Oil prices are high, and it's hard. And it's hard to find workers to get there. Geographically, also, not all metros in the state are back. So here I'm comparing DFW and Austin, for example, are back comfortably above their pre-pandemic levels of employment, but Houston, San Antonio, and El Paso, pictured here, are not back yet. They are improving though, they're hiring, and their employment is growing. But Austin really has been the standout. Austin is on all these charts, the statistical anomaly. It's been booming through the pandemic. I would say largely due to the tech sector. so really 5%, they're 5% above their pre-pandemic level of employment, but North Texas is also above. All right, I did want to make a point about that, about how are we able to grow, or why is it that Texas has been able to outperform the nation and outperform most states in the pandemic in terms of job growth. And I think a significant factor is that we have so much migration to our state. And the other interesting facet of the migration to the state is that in the pandemic, when you think people might have locked down, stayed in their homes, not gone anywhere, they actually picked up and they moved to Texas, even in greater numbers than they did before the pandemic. So that's what this chart is showing you. I've circled Texas, and you can see pre-pandemic net migration in the blue bar, and during the pandemic net migration in the orange bar. And you can see a very significant increase in the number of migrants coming to Texas on net in the pandemic. So actually what we're saying here, and this is work by my colleague Yi-Chin Su, and you can find the article online at the Dallas Fed website. But what we're seeing here is basically that with the work from home regime and people being much more footloose in the pandemic than they were prior to the pandemic, many workers find themselves able to work from anywhere. And so then you're free to seek out, where you want to live, and perhaps you want to move away from some of those high-cost cities on the coast and move to a relatively low-cost place like Texas, where there's also, lower taxes and a fast-growing economy. And that's exactly what happened. Other states I've pictured here on this chart also experienced increases in net immigration during the pandemic, like Florida and North Carolina. All right. Oh, and just one more detail really about this migration that flowed into the state. And this is also important because, as you can see here, I'm showing you really the same thing: pandemic migration to Texas and pre-pandemic migration to Texas, but now it's by metro, not for the states. And so you can see that Dallas, Fort Worth, and Arlington, so North Texas, basically, they took in the most net migrants, followed by Austin. Of course, Austin metro area really has a much smaller population compared to North Texas. So their migration rate is actually astronomically high. And then, but even other metros, San Antonio, Houston, characterized by far greater net immigration during the pandemic than before. So that's very interesting. Now, those first 4 metro areas are very large, but what's also interesting is that this migration also accelerated in smaller metro areas. So whether it's Corpus Christi or Tyler or Waco, well, maybe not Waco, that's an exception, but McAllen, for example. So either these smaller metros experienced less outmigration or more in-migration during the pandemic as compared to prior to the pandemic. So that's another interesting aspect of what happened with migration during the pandemic. All right, so let's fast forward to recent economic performance, and this is kind of going to set the stage for our forecast for 2022. So I mentioned to you earlier that Texas job growth actually sped up, and economic growth in general, but job growth in particular sped up in the second half of 2021. And you can see that here. So Texas job growth, this is a moving average in the blue line, and compared to the red bars, which is US job growth. And you can see sort of US job growth in the second half of 2021, trailing off a little bit, slowing down month over month, whereas Texas has really kept growing at a rapid clip really into December. And so this is significant. Of course, in the earlier part of 2021, we did not do as well compared to the US. And I think partly given the weather today, if you remember, we had the winter storm, which I think did suck some air out of the economy in the first half of 2021, but we came back in the second half. So that was employment data. And here is from our Texas Business Outlook survey, here's some output data from our survey. So we have manufacturing output in blue, and we have service sector revenue growth in red. And when I'm showing you, these are diffusion indexes. So I want you to pay attention to the fact that these bars are really in the white, the white part of the chart, and also above that dashed line. And the dashed line is the average of these indexes, over this whole time period. So what you're seeing is that the manufacturing sector in particular has been characterized after the initial 2 months of the pandemic by really outsized above average growth in production. And that's despite the supply chain disruptions. So we've had very robust growth in manufacturing. Even in December, the most recent observation, manufacturing production was still growing at a robust clip. So the service sector took a little bit longer to come back. You can see from the red line, so maybe it came back closer to the, in the first half of 2021. And then you can see that red bar, the red line is above the dashed line. And so the service sector has also been growing over the last year at a pretty good clip. Now you do see in the service sector, though, in the last observation in the chart, that red line dips really towards zero. And so we had much slower growth in January in our service sector, but we attribute that to Omicron. And so again, this COVID pandemic has been very detrimental to growth in the service sector in particular. And so every time we have a COVID wave, we see the service sector kind of buckle under the weight of that. And if you think, restaurant and hotel visits and other things, if you're not going into the office, you certainly don't need to dry clean your clothes. So those are the things that weigh on the service sector during these COVID waves. The positive thing about the service sector index, though, is that our future indexes for the service sector are telling us that businesses in Texas are still optimistic in the 3 to 6 month outlook for their businesses. And so we interpret this downturn in January as more of a temporary Omicron related event. Okay. All right. So outlook for 2022. So here we go. We've got one slide left before I give you the forecast. So first, I just want to say one of the inputs into our forecasting model for Texas employment growth is US GDP. So US GDP, although we are slowing this year in 2022 compared to 2021, is still expected to grow at a very robust clip in 2022, and certainly even into 2023. US GDP really trend growth is 2% or a little bit under 2%. And so to be growing 2.5% or over 3% is very robust growth. So with that backdrop of the really positive outlook for the US economy is this Texas employment forecast. So we're saying that for 2022, December over December job growth in Texas is going to be between 2 and 4%. We landed conveniently on a point estimate of 3%, as you can see from this chart. So you can see that in 2021, we grew 5.1% December over December, and our forecast for this year is to grow at 3%. Now, 3% is significantly slower than 5%, but it's still above our trend growth rate, which is 2% job growth, and that's still a percentage point above the nation. So 3% for us is still a very robust year. And so we're looking, really, we have a positive outlook for this year for continued strength in the labor market and the economy more broadly in our region. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the risks to the outlook that I mentioned earlier on the overview slide. So obviously our number one risk to the outlook is COVID cases. And so we see from this chart in the purple line, you see the 7-day average of new COVID cases. So those have come down significantly here as Omicron, the Omicron wave seems to be resolving itself. Hospitalizations have flattened, so that's good news. The green line is death, so those are still rising because that's kind of a lagged indicator. But in general, this has been a much less deadly COVID wave than prior ones. Some people have even mentioned that the COVID waves can be an upside risk to growth and not just a downside risk to growth. Suppose that with the Omicron and the Delta and everything, that we have some kind of herd immunity and we're not going to get new variants. well, then maybe growth will even, this will be a positive for growth and could actually be an upside risk. I'm not there yet. Still a little bit skeptical about that, but so I think in our viewpoint, COVID is still a downside risk for growth, especially in how it affects the service sector, and we've just seen very harmful effects on demand for services as a result of these COVID waves. All right. We did ask in these Texas Business Outlook surveys a special question about exactly what is it about this current surge that's affecting your business. And so we gave them several options, and by far, you can see on this chart, 83% of the firms that were experiencing a negative impact from Omicron said it was due to increased absenteeism. So either their workers are sick, or they're taking care of somebody sick, or they're quarantining because they were exposed to somebody who was sick. And so this has really affected almost all of the firms in our surveys, and I would imagine most firms in the Texas economy at large. There are other negative effects that businesses have experienced. We have some listed here: reduced productivity due to alternative work arrangements. Businesses have really had to find ways to accommodate COVID in the workplace, wearing masks or social distancing or bringing people in shifts or working from home. So all of these have implied that they've had to rearrange processes around the public health aspects of COVID. Hiring difficulty is also listed here. And then of course, supply chain disruptions. Lower demand, interestingly, is less of an issue than these supply chain and labor issues that I mentioned here. All right, so on that note, there's another question that we asked was in our December survey of Texas businesses, we asked, what are the top revenue constraints on your business? And we've been asking this question. So for each of the options that you can see on this chart, you can see that when we asked the question in July 20 is the gray bar, and August 21 is the orange bar, and December 21 is the blue bar. And you can see where things have gotten considerably worse. So you can see that 46% of firms said that the biggest revenue constraint in December was limited operating capacity due to staffing shortages. So we're seeing that again, and that's up from 21% in July of 2020. Supply chain disruptions, interestingly, are second on this list. So 44% of firms are saying supply chain disruptions are significant or top revenue constraint. So actually, the staffing shortages are really pressing on businesses as hard or more hard than supply chain disruptions. Weak demand is much less of an issue in general in terms of revenue constraints. So you can see during the initial stages of the pandemic downturn in July of 2020, 57% of firms were saying weak demand was a revenue constraint. But this year, in our December survey just last month, weak demand, only 19% of firms said that weak demand was a revenue constraint. And so we have really had a shifting set of concerns for businesses, where initially in the pandemic there was weak demand, and now it's more supply constraints, whether it's on the labor supply or supply chain. When we asked our business, in our Business Outlook survey, we asked also exactly what is the issue, what are the difficulties in hiring? Because we've seen, you've told us that you've staffing problems, you're telling us that labor shortages is your biggest concern. What exactly is making hiring so difficult? And, it seems kind of common sense, I guess, almost obvious that the first choices and the most popular choices, there's simply a lack of available applicants. There are no applicants for our open positions. And so 73% of firms are telling us that that's a main reason they're having difficulty hiring. Another reason, the second choice of firms, is that workers are simply looking for more pay than is being offered. And what's happening is wages are really going up very quickly, and employers are having trouble keeping up with, what is the going rate, for these positions. And they're trying to offer more pay, but workers, of course, are requesting more than is being offered. And then, other considerations in labor market and in difficulty hiring are the more standard choices, like the applicant lacks the technical, the hard skills, or the applicant lacks experience, or the applicant lacks soft skills. Those are typically, in a normal year, our most common choices for firms complaining they can't find good experienced workers to hire. But in the pandemic recession and the pandemic downturn, we're seeing it's actually just simply the workers aren't there, or they are demanding wages that employers have trouble paying. So with that, you can imagine that all the supply chain constraints, whether it's in the labor market or the supply chain, that this has resulted in considerable wage and price pressures. And so what I'm showing you in these three sets of bars, again, are results from our business outlook surveys. On the first four set of bars is regarding wage inflation. The middle set of bars is regarding input price inflation. And lastly, selling price inflation. And I'm showing you in the first blue bar in each set, the average, pre-pandemic average. And then you can see the lower gray bar in each really set of bars is the inflation during 2020, which was pretty low compared to the average between 2017 and 2019. And then in 2021, we just have this surge, and that's sort of the royal blue bar, 7% wage inflation on average, 10% input price inflation on average among firms in Texas. And lastly, close to 7% inflation in selling prices. And then I've circled the forecast for this year. This is the forecast from our businesses. We asked them, what do you expect wage inflation, input price inflation, and selling price inflation to be this year? How much are you going to raise your selling prices? And again, we get very elevated readings. And so these, I can just tell you, are very different from sort of professional forecasts of wage inflation and consumer price inflation. So our businesses are telling us that there's quite a bit of price pressure left in the pipeline, and they're going to pass these prices, these higher costs, onto consumers. And we also asked them, I believe it was in November, whether they would, how is their pricing power? Are they able to pass on these costs to their consumers? And significantly more said in November that they were able to pass on cost increases than had said so 6 months earlier. So they do have pricing power. People have sort of bought into the fact that inflation and prices are going up. And so this is also sort of the cycle that we have to, nip in the bud here in 2021. Oh, and just to show you, the Texas Business Outlook Survey, it's just firms in Texas, but, we're getting similar, really record readings in the US data, the data for the nation. And so here's the US CPI inflation. The headline measure is in blue here, and you can see that, it spiked to near 7 at the end of last year. And this is really a record rate of price increases. So you'd have to go back to the early 1980s to see such high consumer price inflation in the United States. All right, well, so I can summarize, and I'm looking forward to your questions. This event is put together to give you, more than anything, our Texas employment forecast. And what we're saying is that it's going to be between 2 and 4% growth in employment in Texas in 2022. Our point estimate is 3%. And again, that's a full percentage point above the average rate of growth for our state. So also 3% is more slow than, obviously, slower than 2021, when we grew over 5% in terms of jobs. But we are moving into a more, the last bit, we've actually recovered all our lost jobs, and now we're going to grow past the pre-pandemic level of employment. So we're going to grow a little bit more slowly this year than we did last year. But again, we're well above trend, and we're likely to be outperforming the nation. I did want to again just reiterate that so much of this depends on the accelerated migration of people into Texas. And by people, it's mostly workers, and they're coming from high density, high cost of living areas. And so this is benefiting the Texas economy, certainly, and boosting growth. I mean, this is really the only way we're able to grow so much faster than the nation in terms of employment growth, because really our natural rate of increase, although it's a little bit higher than the nation, it's not that much higher. And so it's really migration that gives us the degrees of freedom to grow this fast. That said, and you can bring this up in the question and the answers, the inflows of migrants are not without some growing pains. And so as I showed you on the housing price chart, we are in Texas experiencing unprecedented house price increases. We are not used to that. Certainly the first 10 years that I lived here, there was no house price appreciation whatsoever. And so this is new for Texas. And we're building, there's considerable building activity going on, but we're still seeing record house price increases. And so that is what I would say can be considered a growing pain. Supply chain disruptions and labor shortages are expected to be a continued drag on growth. We talked about those risks to the outlook. And when we asked in our business outlook surveys when these supply chain disruptions are going to resolve, most businesses are saying they're not going to resolve in the next 6 months. It's going to take more than 6 months. And about a quarter of our respondents to our surveys are saying it's going to take longer than a year. And they said that in November. So our conclusion from the answers to our business outlook surveys is that supply chain, the easing of the supply chain disruptions, most of that is going to happen in the second half of 2022 and not the first half of 2022. So we're not, but that doesn't mean that we're going to see, consistently some relief here as some of these bottlenecks resolve themselves. All right, and further outbreaks of COVID remain a downside risk, obviously. And then the problem with that, again, is that just like the supply chain disruptions and just like labor shortages, these COVID outbreaks are constricting the economy on the supply side and not the demand side so much. And that's really making price pressures that much worse. So price pressures are likely to remain elevated. And as we discussed earlier, that really is our main risk to the outlook this year. Well, great. I think that's a wrap for the presentation, and then I look forward to your questions. Roberto, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Pia. And if you would like to ask Pia a question, I said there's a couple of venues for you. You can type it in on the Q&A box on your screen, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you. And when we call on you, we kindly ask you to please keep your questions as concise as possible so that we can address as many as we can possibly squeeze in with the time allotted here. So with that, Pia, in advance, I apologize to all of you who will submit a question that we may not get to them. But like I said, we'll try to get as many as we can. Pia, there's a lot of questions coming in around the energy sector. And the questions are around the sector is very important for the US economy, definitely very important for Texas. What are you seeing in the energy sector in Texas, and what's the outlook that you foresee for 2022 in energy?
Thank you, Roberto. That's a good question. Didn't get a lot of time really to focus on the energy in the presentation, but that is a very important sector for us in Texas. That is one of the reasons that we have such a different economy from the rest of the nation, is because we have this very large energy sector, both in terms of the production side of the upstream production of oil and gas, but then also the downstream, the production of petrochemicals and petroleum products. But so this year, it's a very positive outlook for oil and gas. We are projecting production increases in both oil and gas. Certainly that's consistent with really the highest oil and gas prices that we've seen probably since 2014. So there's a lot of incentive for producers to drill more wells or complete existing wells and start producing more. I will say that there is considerable demand domestically, but also internationally, especially for liquid natural gas. And I think in terms, I talked to our energy group, I will say the Dallas Fed has probably the best group of energy economists really in the nation, I think. And in talking to them, the one concern about the energy sector, we are saying it's positive outlook and so forth, but there could be some upside risk to the energy prices, and that comes from geopolitical concerns. It comes from several years of lackluster investment in the sector due to climate concerns and other reasons. So it's a little tricky. High oil prices are good for producers, but really high oil prices are probably not good for anyone.
Very good. Thank you, Pia. Then another question came, and this is an interesting question in the sense that you talked a lot about the traditional economic indicators that any economist would look, right? Job growth, unemployment, GDP growth. But can you elaborate a little bit more about the well-being and the impact of COVID on the well-being of Texans? Think about education, health. What are the impacts there from the pandemic?
Yes, so thank you to the person asking this question. I will say that sometimes we get pushback at the Fed because, oh, we're just looking at economic growth and GDP growth and employment growth and so forth, and we're not talking about the indicators that are more related to the welfare of our population, our workforce, and people in general. So a couple things on education that concern us in terms of what's happened in the pandemic. We've done a couple of articles first on the impact of remote learning on elementary and middle school students. And we've seen that state assessments of reading and math have really gone down for students that, especially those that were in, and most students were participating in remote learning. And so that's been a real concern. This means that students are losing ground and not learning as much in the virtual environment. Of course, all students really on average, in terms if you look at racial and ethnic groups, all students lost ground on state assessments in the pandemic. But of course, it was a significantly worse decline in scores for our minority students or students of color. And so that's another concern because we are a majority minority state, and most of our kids, a majority of our kids in school are Black and Hispanic. So we need them to do well, and so we need. There's lots of ground to recover here in terms of performance in school and learning. And then another area of concern in education, what happened in the pandemic is this roaring labor market and these very rapidly rising wages. And interestingly, these wages are actually rising faster for low-skilled workers than they have risen for high-skilled workers. Well, this has drawn more young workers into the workforce and away from college. So college enrollment is down in Texas. It's particularly down for community colleges, and that's where a lot of our first-generation college students go first before they transfer to four-year schools. And so the decline in enrollment is concerning just because, well, it's great that they have high-paying jobs if that's where they, ended up. But one concern is really for the future, because for the future we need, the Texas workforce to have the skills that really are going to be in demand by employers, and that's going to allow them to earn, comfortable wages and achieve a higher standard of living. You also mentioned healthcare, and I just will say that's also pushback we get sometimes when we talk a lot about the healthy economy in our region. One area where we underperform by a large margin is in health coverage or health insurance. So we have in Texas the highest share of uninsured people in the nation, really, of any state. So if we're at the top of the list of states in employment growth, we're at the bottom for insurance coverage as far as healthcare is concerned. And I think in the pandemic, that problem really has received, it's just been a bigger concern than ever before. When these public health concerns arise, like a pandemic, obviously the fact that people may not have access or coverage in the healthcare system, that's a real problem for everyone. Health is, along with education, a really important piece of human capital. So if you think of, we may not think of it as an economic issue in the short term, but in the long term, the education and health status of our population is what's going to achieve, help us achieve, labor productivity and higher standards of living in the long run.
Super. Thank you, Pia. And a reminder to the audience, if you would like to ask a live question of Pia, please just raise your hand, your virtual hand, and we'll get you in the queue and we'll call you in a moment. Pia, there are a lot of questions coming in with respect to real estate. And I think there's the three buckets kind of thing, on the housing aspect, and I think you talked a little bit about it in your presentation, what's your expectations for housing prices and what about demand? You talked about the immigration, people coming in. Is it people, businesses, both? Where are they coming from? So if you can elaborate there. On commercial real estate, it's about, the questions are around supply chain disruptions and wage pressures and wage costs that are picking up for folks that are in the construction. And then on the office front, I'm peppering you here with a lot of questions, but on the office front, what about this concept of hybrid work schedules? And what are you hearing from business leaders as far as office space and what are the prospects for office space in Texas going forward?
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Well, let me see if I can remember all those stages of the question. But let me start by saying, so real estate, especially residential real estate, really boomed through the pandemic downturn. We talked about housing prices. And so they've really been rising really since the middle of 2020. And so we've had this unprecedented appreciation of house prices. And so that's been interesting. And we also had initially, though, we had in terms of multifamily, that's also been really this year, last year, a booming sector in Texas, lots of construction, lots of demand and investment in multifamily housing. But that really came more in 2021. And in 2020, we actually saw rents, even as house prices began to rise, we saw rents continue to fall. And so rents were largely falling in 2020, but then January 21, they really started turning. So now in 2021, we saw, very rapid rent increases, very rapid house price increases. So there's that. Now that said, we do think that, and there are some indications already in the data that the house price appreciation is slowing. And so we should not see anywhere near the house price appreciation this year that we saw last year. So we'll see slowing. Some of that is obviously the rising mortgage rates. And so the economic research shows there's a very close relationship between mortgage rates and house prices. And so when mortgage rates go up, obviously there's less demand, to buy homes, and then house prices, at least we're not forecasting that they're going to come down or decline by any means, but we are forecasting that the rate at which they're rising is going to be significantly moderated this year as compared to last year. The one sector really of real estate that we saw in construction that we saw suffer in the pandemic was office space. And so we saw vacancy rates rise and rise and rise in office, in the office market. And we saw that in Houston, even in Austin and in North Texas. Now, talking to our real estate contacts, it appears that, the office market may have bottomed out. So it may be coming back a little bit. So we might see this year vacancy rates, improve, so get lower, for example, and there'll be more absorption. Companies are bringing people back to work. I think most companies are, and most workers will be working, as you mentioned, hybrid schedule, some days in the office, some days at home for those workers, that are fortunate enough to be able to do that have a job that allows them to do that. So in terms of what are the implications for office space, well, so demand is coming back for some office space, but I will say it's not going to be the office space of yesteryear. It's going to be the office space of, it's going to be less office space for any given number of employees. Firms are going to be looking for smaller spaces, and they'll be using shared space, and they'll be focusing, the office space on meeting spaces. So offices are going to look different, I think. They already look different now. They're going to look increasingly different going forward, because office is going to be, because of the hybrid work environment, when people come together, they're going to come together to meet. And so it's going to be a fundamentally different design, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Pia. There are a number of questions that they would like to see if you can provide us with a little bit of more detail or a look under the hood. So you provide the 3% point estimate growth for job growth, 2 to 4, that's the range. Can you share with the audience a little bit about in which sectors do you think that growth is going to be concentrated? What are the hot spots within the labor market in Texas as far as you can expect for 22?
Well, so that's interesting. I mean, right now, as you can tell, everybody's hiring really across the board, or everybody's trying to hire. So at the moment, there's a lot of hot sectors, if you will, as industries are trying to come back. So even leisure and hospitality, so restaurants, for example, and hotels, they're hiring. Everyone's hiring. Oil and gas is hiring. And so I think there's more a question about what are the lasting changes in terms of what's going to be hot really beyond the recovery, what's going to be hot, 2 to 3 years from now. And I think what we've seen is some of these emerging trends in the pandemic, whether it's e-commerce. So anything related to e-commerce. So we saw booms in industrial real estate, warehousing, logistics, parcel delivery, transportation services that support all those functions. I mean, really just exploded in the pandemic as people did not go to stores, did not go to brick and mortar stores, but ordered more and more online. We also saw in the pandemic this explosion in demand for tech products and tech services, whether it's for Zoom meetings or working from home. Everybody needs another computer, another printer, or everything that goes with that. And so computer occupations boomed in the pandemic. I think that's going to be a lasting change, and that's going to persist. There's other trends out there in the labor market, things that have become pervasive among firms. More and more firms are investing in data analytics, for example. They want to understand the market better. It's a very quickly changing labor market. And with so much change, I think a lot of firms are investing in data analytics. So data science, data analytics is another really surging occupation. And then I would say that, some of the skilled manual labor, we hear a lot from our surveys, and this was a problem even before the pandemic. But with all these retirements, the baby boomers retiring, we're seeing glaring shortages in some areas, which, what you might call blue collar work, but it's actually skilled manual labor, things like whether it's plumbers and electricians and welders and those things. So there's going to be healthy demand for the medium to long term in those areas as well.
Good. Thank you, Pia. There are a few questions with respect to fiscal policy, and the questions are around, all the transfer payments and the stimulus that was provided during the pandemic to households. So what are your thoughts there? Is that creating an impediment for people to come back into the labor market? And then the other set of questions on fiscal stimulus, it's around the infrastructure investment and the Build Back Better, and what are your expectations of impacts of infrastructure bill on the Texas economy?
Yeah, so the stimulus, I guess 2 points about the stimulus programs and sort of their more lasting effects on the economy. One is that what we've realized is a lot of the stimulus money was saved and not spent in the moment. So I showed you how personal income rose during the pandemic and spending rose, but interestingly, savings also rose. So we had record rates of saving as households were receiving these stimulus payments, whether it was stimulus checks, child tax credit, unemployment benefits. Significant amount of this was saved. So that's going to provide some continuing momentum to really the national economy and certainly our state economy in 2022. So that's good. I think whether that's kept people from coming back to the labor force, certainly it's probably allowed some people to remain on the sidelines in the time being. We are counting on them coming back this year, though, hopefully, because we kind of need that, especially to address that wage inflation that we're seeing. We certainly need labor force participation has remained low. It fell during the pandemic. It's remained quite low. It's higher in Texas than it is in the nation, but it's still fallen here as well. So we are looking for workers to trickle back into the labor force, hopefully. So that's going to help really with both growth and inflation, should that come to pass. And you asked about the infrastructure bill, and certainly that infrastructure spending is what economists, like almost all economists, would agree that's one of the best ways to spend government money is on infrastructure. And that's because this is a long-term investment in the capital stock of the nation, and it makes all economic activity really more productive. And so the infrastructure spending, when it rolls out, is going to be a real positive for Texas and for the nation.
Thank you, Pia. So maybe the last question, it's if we can look south of the Rio Grande from Texas, and the question it's around, what about Mexico? Mexico is a very important trading partner for the U.S., for Texas. And what are you seeing there? And two, a lot of folks on the chat box put comments around reshoring, the supply chains, disruptions. Is that making businesses leaders think twice to say, let's bring back some of that manufacturing capacity from other parts of the world into North America? Can you share some thoughts on that front?
Oh, sure. That's really very interesting. So the idea here is whether with all these supply chain disruptions, not least of which in semiconductors, right? These computer chips that everyone needs, that's basically in everything nowadays. So what we found in the pandemic, and even before the pandemic actually, is that these global supply chains, which are sort of very far reaching, very complex, are actually also very vulnerable to things like pandemics, trade wars, and other geopolitical tension. So there might very well be some retrenchment in offshoring. And so we may have a reshoring and nearshoring. And that's good for North America in the sense that some of the business may be these supply chains that normally would be with Asia or China in particular, may now be with Mexico, for example. Mexico and Canada are USMCA partners. And so I think that's probably, how fast that's going to happen and how quickly, and how pervasive it's going to be, I'm unsure. But we know, for example, that many of these large firms, technology firms, are actually, starting to build their own or plants to manufacture semiconductors, right? They don't want to ever go through this again in terms of not being able to get. And I guess, semiconductor production is very concentrated in a few places in the world, including Taiwan, which has something like 40% of global computer chip supply. So obviously with geopolitical tensions, this is a very vulnerable supply chain. So reshoring, nearshoring, and some building of domestic production capacity in some of these key areas, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then you asked about Mexico in more detail, and I think, well, Mexico is a real mixed picture. I think they're back in terms of Mexican manufacturing. They're back above where they were in terms of industrial production prior to the pandemic. So they've recovered their manufacturing sector. Their exports to Texas and to the US are back above where they were prior to the pandemic. But, we just got their preliminary estimate for fourth quarter GDP for Mexico, and it's negative. The growth is negative. And so that's a real concern. And we've seen a lot of negative growth in Mexico in the last few years. And so I think most people are pointing to a lack of investment in Mexico, and that's spilling over into growth, and certainly in the near term, and also, a lack of investment, that's something that's going to hurt their economy in the long run as well. So Mexico's a little bit, on the broad scale, it's a little bit of a mixed picture, but I think the manufacturing sector is doing quite well. And I think with the restoration of the border commerce, the opening of our border with Mexico again, all that is helping.
Thank you, Pia. Thank you so much for a great presentation and discussion with us. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We apologize if we did not get to your questions. We tried to get as many as we could. The recording of today's session and PS slides, and there were a lot of questions in the box as far as PS slides, they'll be available on our website, and we'll be sharing them to you via email as well. Along with information about a couple of events coming up from the Dallas Fed. We'll have a Fed Listens session, and we're going to be talking to you about workers, businesses, and communities and how they are navigating the economic recovery from COVID. And then there will also be information about an upcoming conference that we're actually in real estate, and many of you are interested in real estate, an economic conference we're partnering with Texas A&M Real Estate Research Center. So more details will be coming your way. And in that email, we will be also sending you a link, and we kindly ask you to please fill out the survey, give us your candid feedback so that we can improve the programming for future iterations. Last but not least, I want to thank all the Dallas Fed team and staff who work on this event, putting this event so that we can bring it to you. I want to thank them profusely for their efforts and hard work. And with that, we're adjourned and hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.